at the virtual book tour for the book that just came out, which is Food Safety Lessons for Cannabis-Infused Edibles. And I get to work with my colleague, Brad Douglas. I'm very excited about that. We're just going to have mostly an informal back and forth kind of conversation. I'm going to do a little bit of reading for the book, just a little bit, and address your questions, most importantly. So Amy gave you an introduction to my background. I am a food scientist. I'm a food microbiologist. My area of expertise is pathogen control, and I have a strong background in training and education. That's really where my passion is in training. And through my career, I've gotten to this point now where I've been in consulting for the last 4 years, dipped my toe into the consulting pool a little over 4 years ago. And of course, that was working with the food industry and helping to solve problems. I do recall investigations after companies. That's what I've been working with EAS on, is recall investigations or risk assessments at facilities. And so I'm boots on the ground and extra pair of eyes when I go into facilities and provide assistance through consulting. So Brad, how are you doing there?
I am well, Kathy. I'm looking forward to hearing more about your story and your book.
Yeah, and it's okay that you're a Seahawks fan and I'm a Green Bay Packers fan, and we're going to get along great. So as we had planned, I am going to jump to the first reading and kind of get the audience caught up in how I got to this point in my career with cannabis. It's been a very interesting journey. Life is an adventure. And so in 2018, I went to Food Safety Summit and was talking to my colleague, Rick Byros of Innovative Publishing, and he informed me, we were getting caught up, and he informed me that his son graduated from college and was starting a cannabis website. And that website has evolved into Cannabis Industry Journal, and it's very successful. And that was the first time that I really talked to a food person about cannabis. And then a few months later, another colleague of mine called me looking for assistance in writing a proposal for a cannabis facility and being the person who understands good manufacturing practices and best practices in the food industry and being able to transfer that over to the cannabis industry. And so that got me thinking. I was like, what's going on here with this cannabis industry? And at that point, I had almost no exposure to cannabis. And so everybody has a story, everybody 70 and younger has a story about their first being introduced to cannabis. And so my story is my story. My story happens to be a funny story, and that's one of the reasons why I put it in the book. And so chapter 1 looks like, the publisher is Elsevier. Chapter 1 is introduction to the author. It's personal. I work in the cannabis industry and I don't get high. And let me just read you about my first exposure. So my first exposure to weed was at a dry cleaner. Nearly everyone has a personal story of their first exposure to cannabis. Until 2017, I had almost no exposure to marijuana in my 50+ years of life. I grew up in a small town outside Madison, Wisconsin. Go Badgers. My first job was working 6 hours per week at one dry cleaner in town and closing up after the full-time ladies finished. I was 16 and alone when one day a high school teacher of mine came in to pick up his dry cleaning. I knew him well from after-school activities he supervised. It was custom to staple anything found in the pockets of the clothes of the paper to the paper ticket, stapled to the plastic bag. When I retrieved his dry, clean sports coat from the turning rack, there on the ticket was stapled a baggie of weed. As I did with all the customers, I simply asked if the staple item belonged to him. He was not able to get a yes or no out among the stammering, but he paid the dry cleaning bill and left with the sport coat and bag of weed. At that time, I literally had no idea it was weed. Given his reaction, it is only my logical conclusion that it was weed. It could have been oregano. So my story is funny, and that's not true for everyone. I want to bridge into talking about regulation. So in the United States, we do not have federal regulation for cannabis, and I know that we have a lot of government people on the call with us today. So I want to talk a little bit about regulation. What we're looking forward to in regulation is that when marijuana is descheduled, then we can have federal regulation for control of edibles. So let me back up just a second. So during the Nixon administration, there was the war on drugs, and the administration was fighting the use of LSD, heroin, and they lumped marijuana into that classification, and that classification is called Schedule 1. The act is Controlled Substances Act. Schedule 1 is the most severe or highest risk drugs, and that act is enforced by the Drug Enforcement Administration. So because it's an act, it would literally take an act of Congress to change that and to move marijuana off of the Schedule 1 list. And that's where it still sits today, right? So, so that's why we don't have any federal regulation right now. Is it the first step toward federal regulation is descheduling of marijuana off of that list, that DEA Schedule 1 list. So to that point, we have all kinds of state code and local code. And what I was thinking about, as far as an analogy goes, is many of the people on the call are familiar with the food code. And the food code, FDA has a food code. Most of the states adopt the federal food code, but not all. And that is for a restaurant and retail operations for food service. So when I lived in Chicago, I was in Chicago for 15 years, not always in Green Bay, but for 15 years I was in Chicago. And so imagine that you go to a restaurant in Chicago, and that restaurant has to report or be responsible in compliance with the code for the city of Chicago, and Chicago's in the county of Cook County. So that restaurant is also in compliance with Cook County food code. And then that restaurant is also in compliance with state of Illinois food code. And Illinois, I don't know, but Illinois may or may not have adopted the federal food code. And so as you go from state to state to state, there may be variation, just a little bit. It's all kind of the basic same compliance, but there can be some changes. So now that analogy, take yourself to the city of Denver and a cannabis facility. A cannabis facility, it must be under compliance of the city of Denver. They must be under compliance for the county, and they must be under compliance for the state. And there is no federal regulation that the state can look to as a model. So every single state that is writing regulation, they are free to write that regulation however they want to. And then, of course, there's no interstate commerce. I'm going to take a pause here, Brad. What are you thinking?
I think that's an excellent analogy, because I think some of the operators that produce cannabis-infused edibles at this point sometimes struggle with what they perceive as a patchwork of regulations. And I think that's a great analogy, that you have differences state to state, locality to locality. And I'd offer the question to you, especially for those that are new to perhaps food safety and food regulations. What are the top 3 things that they should think about to be comfortable with regulations, to understand that these are beneficial to their business and not something that they should just comply with and just think about when a regulator stops by for an inspection or it stops by for a visit?
Mm-hmm. Right, and it's really all about successful business operations in the long run. We don't want people to just jump in to think they're going to get rich quick. We really want the food safety and now the edible safety to be applied. And so my recommendation to companies is to first be in compliance with all those local codes. So if they do have, well, they will have some city code, municipality code that might be there, the county and then the state. And that really is the foundation as far as building food safety. That right now we're in a situation where cannabis companies are just trying to be under compliance, in compliance. And what people like you and I are doing is trying to get them beyond that. So then the next step is to look to the FDA regulations and use those as a model. So we have food safety regulation from FDA. We have dietary supplement regulation from FDA. We have pharmaceutical regulation from FDA. And so even though we really don't know how this is all going to shake out with FDA, we look to the existing rules and laws that are there, and that will up the game for the cannabis companies as they go from what is absolutely required to going beyond their current regulation and getting ready for the future, if they're in it for the long run. If they're serious about this and they really want to survive, that's where they need to be looking. And then my third point would be that in the future, there may be some companies that are doing this now and not as strong on the regulation side as I am on the technical science side, but in the future, companies are going to want to export. So maybe they want to export to Europe, and Europe has a good manufacturing practices standard. It's EU GMPs, and I hear and I read that they are extremely rigorous. And to try to get that certification for EU GMPs is going to be required in many cases for exporting, and it's going to bring the level of food safety up.
Well, I think that's a great answer and a great primer for some that may have started producing cannabis-infused products in the experience with food safety that you and I have. To go off of what you said there, I'm curious when you think, in what instances it makes sense for companies really to start planning now to go beyond their current state requirements for their facilities or their operations, and how to think about a world where they might have some sort of federal legalization, and how to think about that maybe from an FDA perspective, who currently cannot weigh in and provide guidance on state cannabis operations.
Right, and to that question also is that most cannabis companies that we know, I will have you shake your head if you agree with this, are employing people where those people are wearing many hats. They're overworked, and the cannabis industry, it's just so hard to keep up with regulation. It's so hard to keep up with what is new and be a viable business. And so that's where I would plug people like you and me of having companies bring in technical expertise, because you want to find people who have basically lived their whole life in food safety, in dietary supplement safety, in addition to your expertise with labeling law as well, because cannabis industry is a big deal on labeling. And to reach out. Basically, the cannabis industry has come from a place where they were hiding in the shadows and trying not to get caught, and it was very secretive and it was very isolated. And now we're bringing it all out into the open, at least in states where it's legal. And it takes a different kind of mindset to reach out to your peers. In food safety, we say that food safety is not competitive. We are all in this together to make sure that the product that we serve is safe for the consumer. And so whenever you're talking about food safety with your contract laboratory, with your peers in another company, we're all trying to get to the point of best practices in the cannabis industry. And so I would encourage them to reach out, which is hard for anyone, especially when you're working so hard and having to juggle so many things.
Yes, especially in our COVID world, where every day seems like it's a new fire to put out or a new challenge. But I 100% agree with you. Well, I want to remind our attendees, so I don't monopolize the questions here, that the Q&A panel is open. I'm monitoring that too, so I'm happy to ask some questions of Kathy if you have them. And I also don't want to keep asking you questions, Kathy. I know that you wanted to do a few more excerpts from your book in different chapters. So.
Yeah, I'm just gonna wrap up one topic that's related to what we've been talking about, and that's the immunocompromised consumer. And so in the book, I say that it's personal. I read that when I read the first excerpt. And for me, I have an immune disorder that is similar to rheumatoid arthritis, similar to juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. So for a lot of people in the cannabis industry, there is that empathy of understanding the consumer, but a lot of people get into the cannabis industry for other reasons. And so in terms of food safety, I just want to remind everyone that the edibles that are being manufactured by cannabis facilities are at a very high stakes, because the company has to assume that that edible is going to be consumed by an immunocompromised adult. And so following what the food industry is doing for food safety is absolutely critical. We want cannabis facilities to identify their hazards. If people on the call are not familiar with the FDA regulation, you may be familiar with HACCP, Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Points. And so we apply that to edibles to make sure that that finished product is indeed safe and that we do no harm to the consumer. And the consumers who are medical patients are already compromised. We know that they're compromised. And so should there be a pathogen in an edible, it's something that a non-compromised person could possibly consume and not get ill, but a immunocompromised consumer has a greater risk for becoming ill. So I just want to make that point, which is a huge point. Let me turn to chapter 10. So I live in Wisconsin. I live in Green Bay. And before coronavirus, I would travel either to client sites to work within a facility, or I did a lot of in-person training, face-to-face training.
If many cannabis companies are focusing so much on the dosage that needs to go in these products and the serving sizes, and that's important, how do you bring back the focus on some of these underlying issues that food safety experts realize exist in some of these markets and facilities. And you're talking about biological hazards, microbiological issues, and particularly in some states, you can't have kill steps for some of these products.
Mm-hmm.
How do you bring the focus not only to the businesses and the business operators, but also some of the regulators in these states that may be new to these diverse range of products?
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that kind of drives me crazy, and I've been trying to communicate to people, is that when you do your hazard analysis for your process, there is a big difference between what the state is requiring to be tested versus what the significant hazards are. And I think that the cannabis industry is caught between a rock and a hard place because, first of all, testing is mandated and is extremely expensive, and that's one of the reasons why edibles are so expensive. So what we were talking about before, as far as make sure that you're meeting state regulation, is really important, but it may not be addressing the hazards. So when a cannabis company is writing their hazard analysis, they need to do a hazard analysis of every ingredient that goes into the edibles. And there may be some ingredients like chocolate discs or chocolate bars, the large chocolate bars, where the supplier is controlling the hazard. And if the supplier is controlling the hazard, then they have to work really closely with that supplier. So for example, salmonella is associated with chocolate. And you mentioned no kill step. If the cannabis company is just getting in chocolate bars, large chocolate bars, melting them, and then adding ingredients and making their bars for sale, there is no kill step. And so they're relying on that chocolate maker to control the pathogen, and then they're relying on their GMPs to make sure that no other pathogen gets in during any step of the process at their facility. And so, so a little bit more directly answer your question, every cannabis facility, every cannabis company needs someone who understands hazard analysis. And in the food side of it, the FDA has regulated that there is a person who is a preventive controls qualified individual. It's a 2.5-day workshop that I teach. And in that way, it is the training that FDA expects someone to have who can really do the proper research if needed, have the proper understanding of what the hazards are. So for those that are new to the cannabis industry, in addition to micro, cannabis edibles for state testing, it's either you would look at your state code and you would look to see what is tested on the flower, that part of the plant that is has the THC and the CBD or other cannabinoids. There would be testing of the extract, and when you think of an extract, think of making a recipe where you put butter into the recipe, like a batch of cookies, or where you put an oil into a recipe, and that is the recipe ingredient that brings in the cannabinoids like THC. So then you have the edible. So then you have the finished product, which is the edible. And so the cannabis industry has to test for pesticides, which is a huge deal. It has to test for residual solvents. So if that extract was made with a solvent, which most are, it has to be food grade. It has to be, that extract has to be tested to make sure that those other solvents are not there as a chemical contaminant. Heavy metals, so lead, mercury, arsenic, cadmium may be regulated by the state. And so there is a lot of testing that goes in, even when, because it's state mandated, even when you may know your suppliers. You may know that there's no way that those hazards could be in the product, either in the flower or the extract, and then get into your edible. So what I'm hoping for as time goes on is that things will settle down, and this will only happen with FDA regulation, in that cannabis companies will be responsible in the future for identifying hazards and then controlling those hazards.
I think that's a great answer. And I'll follow that up with a bit more on HACCP, hazard analysis and critical control points. You mentioned all the testing that's required in state regulated systems, and that's mostly done on end products. The critical control points of HACCP, how important do you think it is for operators in the cannabis industry to be testing at points along their process? So testing perhaps ingredients or testing intermediate products.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the whole purpose of HACCP. And that's the whole purpose of preventive controls, that we don't want to wait until that edible is completely done and made to then test it and find out that there was a problem. It is important to monitor processing. It is important to understand the hazards that could be coming in with your ingredients. It is important to make sure that your facility itself is not contaminated with a pathogen like Listeria monocytogenes, Salmonella again, and that you are controlling it. So, for example, I was working with a hemp processor where the plant was harvested and shipped, transported to the facility. It went through something like a wood chipper kind of thing where it was ground up, and then it went into extraction. And that they knew that that concentrate that they were making would then go into edibles. So the plant material coming into the facility at receiving absolutely had pathogens on it. It had generic E. coli, it could have had Salmonella, Listeria is ubiquitous in nature, so you totally expect there to be pathogens coming to the facility at receiving. And so it becomes a matter of foot traffic, forklift traffic, setting up barriers to make sure that those pathogens that are present in the raw material don't get cross-contaminated into the finished product. And so we work through some of the steps that they could do to ensure that. Having dedicated employees, air curtains where we don't have the airflow from raw to finish, those kinds of things are just normal procedures in the food industry. And we want the cannabis industry to learn from the food industry and from the dietary supplement industry.
I couldn't agree more. I'll ask another question. So this goes beyond just business operators in the cannabis industry making infused products. Do you see a place for state regulators who perhaps may be used to relying on federal regulation or guidance from federal agencies to think through their regulations and how to improve them with a group like EAS Consulting or with professionals like yourself?
Absolutely. In that, so the big rule that we have in the food industry is preventive controls for human food. That was part of FSMA, which is the Food Safety Modernization Act that was signed in 2011 and came under enforcement in 2016. So the food industry has been getting up to speed since 2015. The larger companies had to be under compliance and then were under enforcement in 2016. The same has been happening with the FDA inspectors. So they have a wonderful training program. It actually starts with the exact same workshop that the industry people get, the Preventive Controls Qualified Individual, PCQI training. And then they go beyond that and end up doing a shadowing of someone who is trained and then eventually get set loose to do their own inspections. So as FDA has been training, our state inspectors have been training as well. So state inspectors, states will sign, I believe, a memorandum of understanding, but they will get the same training that the FDA inspectors are getting, starting with that PCQI and then going beyond that. I don't know how many states have that at this point. I'm not sure, but certainly those resources are there for the state inspectors. A lot of times it's the Department of Public Health, and in the state there may be a Department of Agriculture. So it just depends on who is going to be doing those inspections at the cannabis facility, whether those inspectors are trained to inspect food facilities versus are they trained to inspect restaurants. And so if they are trained to inspect food facilities, I'm very hopeful that they will be applying all of the same tools that we have, all of the same resources that we have, and then get the cannabis industry aligned at the state level with whatever they can do. Absolutely.
And I think there's certainly a willingness to work together collaboratively out there with state cannabis regulators. A lot of them understand that we're flying the plane while we're still building a wing, and they are looking for those experts in the field or their colleagues in other states to collaborate to find and develop the best standards and regulations that are possible. So I
mm-hmm. Yeah, and on the FDA side, the first 3 years approximately, the mantra was educate before regulate. And so the understanding was that FDA would be working with industry. We want that to continue. We want to have a good working relationship where inspectors are coming into facilities, they're knowledgeable, food industry is trained, they're not knowledgeable, and all working together wherever you can find those resources.
Well, let me ask you another question that I feel comes up a lot when talking about how to regulate cannabis. And here I'm just going to speak to cannabis-infused products, so those things that are taken by mouth or ingested. The question that often arises is, are food GMPs perfectly suited in any regulations governing a food manufacturing facility, or are there certain cases where a pharmaceutical GMP or say a dietary supplement GMP will come into play, especially for dosage forms that aren't typical in food, your tablets, your capsules,
Mm-hmm.
your gummies? Is there an amalgam of GMP thinking that should be applied to cannabis infused products?
That's only knocking around in my head. So it's an extremely difficult situation because we don't know how FDA is going to regulate cannabis-infused edibles. So I have come from the standpoint that if the cannabis-infused edible industry follows the FDA food rules, all will be well. And Canada to the north has the Cannabis Act, and they chose, at least at the beginning, to regulate edibles as if they are food. And that's a significant decision to make. But then as time has gone on, and I have continued my journey in learning about cannabis, I understand the importance of potency, and that is an absolute for labeling on the packaging for the consumer so that they know how much THC is in a serving, or other cannabinoids as well. So that sounds like dietary supplements. And so the labeling, I think, is a little bit more toward the dietary supplement side. I'm hoping that the food safety or the edible safety will be more on the food side. Pharmaceuticals is just a whole different ballgame because of the drug tests that have to be done, submitted to FDA and approved by FDA. So the first drug that was approved by FDA under pharmaceutical was Epidiolex, and that's CBD, a CBD product. One of the resources that you can look at for this thinking is National Cannabis Industry Association, NCIA. They put out a white paper on October 1st of last year, and it proposes 4 different lanes for regulation of THC and CBD products, including the edibles, including the pharmaceuticals as well. And so I would point our readers or our listeners to those sources, that source in particular.
I think that's a great place to point people. And there are a number of resources out there that are being developed, and are, a lot of quality resources. You mentioned Canada and how they have federal cannabis regulation, and FDA's colleagues to the north in Health Canada has and doesn't have to, that they can come out with their mandate and bring their experience in food safety, food GMPs to bear. And although FDA's or the regulations we have here in the US aren't perfectly mirrored in Canada, they are a good resource, I'd say, for the thinking through systems and preventative controls, along with some of the nice resources that have been put out by industry associations.
Right. And what's really interesting in Canada here for the food industry, as I've mentioned, we have PCQI, whereas in Canada, they have a different title for that position, which is Quality Assurance Person, or QAP. And in addition, the credentials of that individual have to be sent to a government office for approval. So the Canadian government essentially is recognizing and approving the quality assurance person at a facility. I can't imagine FDA doing that, but yeah.
Well, we know there's many in FDA that are interested in paying attention to this area. They just don't have the federal mandate without legalization currently to answer officially. So we know that they're paying attention, and they are thinking of a lot of ways to guide the industry, even if they can't be public about it. Well, let me ask you.
And also I want to turn that question back to you. So sure. Your strength is dietary supplements. So the same type of question back to you. Where do you see the strength of what's available for dietary supplements being applied to edibles?
Well, this is certainly a tricky question, and I think it's being asked in a number of state regulatory agencies and in the industry at large. And I'd say the recommendation or the suggestion that I often hear is that you may be able to bifurcate the types of cannabis-infused edibles that you have. So bifurcate a system that is more food-like or more dietary supplement-like. Dosage forms that are small and capsules or tablets, or perhaps even gummies, may align more with dietary supplement requirements, whereas your brownies or beverages, things like that, may have labeling or manufacturing requirements that more align with food systems. But that's a challenge. I mean, everybody wants to have a system that is as streamlined as possible, that you don't have different requirements for different types of products. But that's one challenge we face with cannabis products. You have this whole host of product types that cross your traditional regulatory boundaries. There's no other product type that's regulated across product forms, perhaps with the exception of tobacco, that it presents a challenge for having a uniform regulatory system. So I would put that idea out there, and I don't have all the answers, but I think that for those dosage forms that are more like supplements, you might have more supplement type regulations, manufacturing and labeling, and those that are more like food, you have it more like food regulations and labeling.
Mm-hmm.
And
And I've talked about the laboratory testing, the extensive laboratory tests that are done, the expense of that laboratory testing to a cannabis facility, and what is your experience looking at tolerances of potency? Because I've read that there are some state codes that are like plus or minus 10%. What are you seeing?
there are some state codes that are plus or minus 10%. There are some that don't necessarily have tolerances. There's some state laws that require no tolerance on the upper range in grams of THC with no cushion, because that's the legal limit. And that's an important part to think about, because whatever the regulated industry is, whether it's dietary supplements, pharmaceuticals, when you're looking at test results, you're always taking into account the tolerances, understanding what the limits of the lab are, what the limits of random changes are in your sample processing. But I don't know if that's come to prime time yet in cannabis businesses thinking about how to make consistent products, how to make safe products. But I think it's an absolutely critical concept that you do think about. Now, you do have tolerances for your product. And if I could make a suggestion, I would say that perhaps tolerances that are a bit higher than 10% are perhaps more likely to be achievable, particularly for these complex matrices, like some of these cannabis-infused products. And I'll toot my own horn here a bit. It's been about 4 years now, that we published an article in the Journal of American Medical Association that looked at the consistency and dosage of cannabis edibles. Granted, the industry has come a long way in the past 4 years, but at that time you saw a wide variation in those dosages, and you weren't even close to the plus or minus 10% that we're talking about here. So I think it's a process of getting to that end goal that you're hoping to achieve. And I think if we impose a plus or minus 10% tolerance at this point, that it's very challenging to achieve at this point in time.
And there are a lot of groups that are working on that, but it's another example as far as test methods go. For example, AOAC has CASP, C-A-S-P, as a working group. But it's another reason why we need federal regulation, because some of our listeners might not know that without federal regulation, our public universities cannot do research because it's an illegal substance. It's almost impossible for them to jump through the hoops of obtaining product samples, setting up a lab and doing the testing. And of course you want to have standards and things like that to make sure that your tests are operating as they should, proficiency testing. So, we will, without regulation, we will be looking to other countries. So there are universities in Canada that are doing research. I have read that Israel has done a lot of research, maybe more on the medical side, rather than the edible laboratory testing kind of thing. And it's only after descheduling that we will be able to encourage those best practices, the standard methods, the creation of understanding how to handle this product. Because of the waxy substances in cannabis, naturally, it's very difficult to do laboratory testing. It's not just like blending up something that dissolves in water easily. And so there's a lot of challenges with laboratory testing that way. And as far as company knowledge goes, a lot of that knowledge is still in silos and not being shared readily because it's you have to find a forum to be able to share that. So we have a lot of isolation within the testing community for that reason.
Yeah.
And the reason that the universities can't do that research is that if they were, most of them, from what I've heard, the feedback that I've gotten when I ask about it is that if they did research on an illegal substance, they are jeopardizing their federal funding. And the public universities have a lot of federal funding. And they can't do that. It's just can't do it.
That's a concern.
Yeah.
Well, I know we're getting close to the end of our hour. I wanted to ask a couple of audience questions that have come in. And then if we have time, I'd like to circle back to the labs. The labs are such a critical part of the cannabis industry at this point. They play such an important role, and sometimes that role isn't appreciated. So I'd like to circle back. But before I do, I have a labeling question. So I'm going to pose this one to you. If you want to punt it back to me, feel free. The question is, what is most appropriate for cannabis-infused edibles? A nutrition facts label or a supplement facts label?
I love that question. You cannot do either. You cannot do a supplement facts label because legally a cannabis-infused edible is not a dietary supplement. And the supplement facts label is federally regulated for dietary supplements. You cannot do a nutrition facts label because that is for food, and the nutritional and cannabis-infused edible legally is not a food. So as long as you do not use the same form, as long as you don't call it supplement fact or nutrition fact, as at least that's my recommendation, you can put the information on the label in your own unique format. You can do it as a list or however you want. Just don't format it like the federally regulated labels. I have seen the information presented where it says cannabis facts. That might be a compromise.
I couldn't answer that question any better than myself. And I think a key concept you hit upon there is the doctrine of intended use, correct? Where FDA or federal regulators will look at a product, and depending on how it's labeled and the directions for use, they'll determine what you intend that product to be for. And by putting a nutrition facts or labeling nutrition facts or supplement facts, you tell a federal regulator that this is a food or a dietary supplement. And right. As of right now, cannabis products can't, especially those containing THC, can't be either of those. Mm-hmm. So I think that's great. Well, we're almost done. I'll slip this laboratory question in and we can talk a little bit more about it to run a few minutes over. In terms of laboratories, in terms of the relationships that manufacturing companies develop with laboratories, how important is that? Should you develop a very strong relationship with your laboratory, or should you just send your samples in, get your certificates of analysis back, and just pay to have your rubber stamp?
Oh, well, my background includes working in testing laboratories and training technicians to work in laboratories. So I am a huge proponent of laboratories and the work that they do, and they are a resource for the cannabis industry. So absolutely, you should be on a first name basis with customer service at your laboratory, and maybe even the lab manager, maybe even a chemistry supervisor or a microbiology supervisor. Hit them up with questions, anything that you have a question about. They're your go-to people. Absolutely. Yeah.
Absolutely agree. Well, since we've run at the end of our hour, I would like to put it back to you in terms of your book. It's been a labor of love. You have a lot of yourself and your personal story in there. Any parting words for our attendees on why they should go out and buy this book?
Just the last thing is, for the cannabis industry, don't reinvent the wheel. The supporting industries of pharmaceutical, dietary supplements, food, we've been doing this for a long time. We understand the challenges, and especially the service companies like your cleaning and sanitizer companies, those kind of people, they're all here to help. So we are here to help.
Absolutely. We agree. And us at EAS Consulting are all here to help. We have a variety of expertise and backgrounds. And if you think we could be of help to your company, your state, perhaps, please reach out.
All right. Thanks, Fred.
Yep. Thank you, Kathy. Take care. Have a good day.
You too.